Hello, in this tutorial we will learn about the architecture of Angular 2. So as previously discussed, there are 8 main building blocks of Angular 2 application, and these are module, component, template, metadata, data binding, directive, services, and dependency injection. Now let's take one by one. First is module. Angular apps are modular, and Angular has its own modularity system called Angular modules or NG modules. Every Angular app has at least one module class, that is the root module, conventionally named as app module. While the root module may be the only module in a small application, but most apps can have multiple feature modules. Now, component. A component controls a patch of screen called a view, or a component is a controller class with a template which mainly deals with a view of the application and logic on the page. The class interacts with the view through an API of properties and methods. For instance, let's say we have fruit list component has a fruit property that returns an array of fruits that it acquires from a service. Fruit list component also has a select fruits method that sets a selected fruit property when the user clicks to choose a fruit from that list. Now, template. The component's view can be defined by using the template, which is a form of HTML that tells Angular how to render the component. For example, this is the simple template which shows how to render fruit list and display selected fruit. And now, metadata. As we all know, metadata is something data about data. In Angular 2, metadata tells how to process a class. For instance, look at the code for fruit list component. You can see that it's just a class. There is no evidence of framework, no Angular in it at all. So, to tell Angular that fruit list component is a component, attach metadata to the class. Here's the @component decorator, which identifies the class immediately below it as a component class. Here, selector, template URL, and providers are configuration options. Now, data binding. Data binding plays an important role in communication between a template and its component. Imagine without a framework, you would be responsible for pushing data values into the HTML controls and turning user responses into action and value updates. Writing such push-pull logic by hand is tedious, error-prone, and a nightmare to read, as any experienced jQuery programmer can attest. Angular supports data binding, a mechanism for coordinating parts of a template with the parts of a component by adding binding markups to the template to tell Angular how to connect both sides. As the diagram shows, there are four forms of data binding syntax. Each form has a direction to the DOM from the DOM or in both direction. First is interpolation. It displays the component value within the div tags. Second, property binding. It passes the property from the parent to the property of the child. Third, event binding. It fires when you click on the component's method name. And the last one, two-way binding. Two-way binding is an important fourth form that combines property and event binding in a single notation by using the ng model directive. Here are the examples of data binding, how it is going to be used in template. Now, services. Services are JavaScript functions that are responsible for doing a specific task only. Angular services are injected by using dependency injection. We'll talk about this later. Generally, services is a class which can perform something specific, such as logging service, data service, message service, text calculator, and the configuration of applications, etc. There is nothing much about this service in Angular and there is no service based class. But still, service can be treated as a fundamental to the Angular application. Now, directive. Angular templates are dynamic. When Angular renders them, it transforms the DOM according to the instruction given by the directives. A directive is a class with a @directive decorator. So, technically, we can say that a component is a directive with a template. There are two types of directive: structural directive and attribute directive. Now, structural directive. Structural directives alter layout by adding, removing, and replacing elements in DOM. Here, the example template uses two built-in structural directives. That is, ng4 tells Angular to stamp out one li per fruit in the fruits list, and ngIf includes the fruit detail component only if a selected fruit exists. Second is attribute directive. Attribute directive alters the appearance or behavior of an existing element. In template, they look like a regular HTML attribute. The ngModel directive, which implements two-way data binding, is an example of attribute directive. And the last thing, you can also write your own directive. Components such as fruit list component are one kind of custom directive. And now, the last and very important concept is dependency injection. Dependency injection is a way to supply an instance of a class with the fully formed dependencies it requires. Most dependencies are services. Angular uses dependency injection to provide new component with the services they needed. Angular can tell which services a component needs by looking at the types of its constructor parameter. For example, the constructor of your fruit list component needs a fruit service. When Angular creates a component, it first asks an injector for the services that the component requires. An injector maintains a container of service instances, let's say service A, service B, and fruit service, that it has previously created. If a requested service instance is not in the container, the injector makes one and add it to the container before returning the service to Angular. When all requested services have been resolved and returned, Angular can call the component's constructor with those services as arguments. This is dependency injection. So, this was the whole architecture of Angular 2. You have learned the basic about the 8 main building blocks of an Angular application. That's a foundation for everything else in the Angular application. And it's more than enough to get going. But it doesn't include everything you need to know. So, in the next tutorial, we will go ahead with the environment setup for Angular 2. Thanks for watching.